After Claire left the shooting range, a strange silence hung in the air. The Sharps, who were once so confident, stood together, still processing what had just happened. The laughter and jokes they had made moments ago now seemed foolish. No one knew what to say. No one knew how to explain the perfect shot Claire had made. Jake, who had been so sure of himself, stared at the target as if it would somehow give him the answer he was looking for. He couldn't believe it. His mind kept replaying the shot, the way Claire had taken it without a second thought, and how the bullet had hit the center of the target without even grazing the edges. It wasn't luck. It wasn't a fluke. It was skill. I can't believe it, Jake muttered, shaking his head. His usual cocky attitude was nowhere to be found. It was replaced with a look of disbelief. She's not a beginner. Not like we thought. Leah, standing beside him, was just as stunned. Yeah, she agreed, still staring at the target. I thought she was just some random person who didn't know what she was doing. She paused, feeling a strange mix of embarrassment and respect. But that was impressive. The rest of the Sharps were equally quiet. They were starting to understand that Claire wasn't someone to be taken lightly. She hadn't been there to show off or prove herself. She had simply come to do what she loved, shoot. And in doing so, she had completely silenced their mockery. As the group stood in silence, they began to reflect on their actions. They had assumed, based solely on Claire's appearance, that she was inexperienced. They had laughed, made fun of her, and even challenged her, thinking it would be easy to prove their superiority. Now they realized how wrong they had been. Claire had shown them that it wasn't about the clothes you wore or the rifle you carried. It was about skill, focus, and respect for the sport. We were so focused on ourselves, Leah said quietly. On our gear, our rifles. We forgot the most important part. She looked around at her friends. It's not about looking good. It's about being good. Jake nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on the target. Yeah, we were all too busy showing off, thinking we were the best. But he trailed off, not knowing how to finish the thought. She didn't care about any of that. She just shot. The Sharps stood together for a while longer, lost in thought. The range had returned to its usual noise, with other shooters coming and going. But for the Sharps, everything felt different now. They had learned a lesson they hadn't expected to learn that day. That true skill didn't need to be flaunted or advertised. It simply existed. As they began packing up their things, they didn't joke or laugh like they normally would. Instead, there was a quiet respect in their movements. Claire had made an impact on them, one that wouldn't be easily forgotten. They realized that sometimes it wasn't about the loudest person in the room, but the one who simply showed up and let their actions speak for themselves. And as they left the range, they couldn't help but think of Claire's perfect shot. A reminder that true mastery doesn't need to prove anything. It simply speaks for itself. A few weeks had passed since Claire's perfect shot at the shooting range, and the Sharps had made a quiet change in their approach. They no longer spent their time boasting or making fun of others. Instead, they focused more on improving their own skills, giving each other tips when needed, and respecting everyone at the range, regardless of who they were or what they looked like. One Saturday, while they were practicing at Ridgewood Range, something unexpected happened. Claire returned. The Sharps had no idea she would come back, and as soon as she walked in, they all noticed her. She still wore the same simple clothes, her old rifle slung across her shoulder. There was no fanfare, no crowd gathered around her. She just quietly set up at an empty lane and began preparing for her next round of shooting. The Sharps stood a little taller this time. They didn't laugh or whisper. There was no mockery in their eyes, only curiosity and respect. They had learned their lesson and didn't want to repeat their past mistakes. They exchanged glances, silently acknowledging that they had been wrong the last time they had seen Claire. After a few moments, Jake, who had been the loudest of the Sharps, walked up to Claire's lane. He wasn't sure if she would remember him, but he felt the need to say something. He cleared his throat nervously before speaking. "Hey," Jake began, his voice a little softer than usual. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for the way we acted before. We were wrong about you." Claire didn't immediately respond. She simply looked up at him with the same calm expression she had worn the first time they had met. Her eyes didn't hold any anger or judgment, just a quiet understanding. You didn't deserve that, Jake continued. We were acting like we were the best, and well, we learned the hard way that it's not about showing off. It's about respect. Claire finally gave a small nod, her gaze returning to the target in front of her. She didn't need to say anything. Her actions spoke louder than any words could. She was there to shoot, and that was what mattered. Jake stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of his apology. He was proud of himself for saying the right thing, even if it was long overdue. The Sharps gathered around, and one by one, they also offered their apologies. Leah was the next to approach, speaking softly. I never should have laughed at you. We should have seen you for the skilled shooter you are. Claire nodded again, accepting their apologies without making a big deal out of it. She didn't need to forgive them with grand gestures. She had already moved on. She simply stood tall, her focus on the target ahead. Soon, the Sharps returned to their lanes, and a new sense of respect filled the air. They no longer saw Claire as an outsider or a beginner. They saw her as a fellow shooter, someone who had earned their respect with one quiet, perfect shot. From that moment forward, they knew better than to judge anyone based on appearances or assumptions. As Claire took her next shot, the Sharps watched in silence, no longer competing with her, but quietly admiring her skill. They had learned that sometimes the best way to grow was not to show off, but to simply show up and do your best. Claire had taught them that lesson without saying a word. The Sharps gathered at the edge of their shooting lanes, still eyeing Claire. They couldn't help themselves. It was almost too easy to make fun of someone who didn't seem to belong. They had seen it all before. Newcomers who didn't know the first thing about shooting, who came in thinking they could handle a rifle like they had been doing it for years. They were usually gone within an hour, frustrated and embarrassed. Watch this, Jake said with a grin, nudging his friends. He raised his voice just loud enough for Claire to hear. Maybe we should give her a few tips. I bet she could use some help. The group laughed, but Claire didn't look up. She was still setting her stance, making sure everything was in place. The Sharps exchanged glances, their laughter growing louder. Leah, with her bright pink shooting gloves, leaned in closer to Jake and whispered, she probably doesn't even know what that rifle's for. Yeah, Jake responded, his tone dripping with sarcasm. She's probably just here to look at the targets. His friends laughed harder now, their voices echoing through the range. They couldn't believe someone would come here, acting so serious, without the right gear or experience. Claire, however, kept her focus. She wasn't bothered by their laughter, though they did notice the way her eyes seemed to narrow just slightly as she lined up her shot. The Sharps continued to talk among themselves, pointing and laughing, assuming the woman wouldn't even hit the target. I mean, really, Leah said, shaking her head. She's probably not even capable of getting close to the bullseye. Maybe she'll surprise us and miss the whole target, Jake added, grinning. The group erupted into more laughter, oblivious to how far their mockery had gone. Claire didn't let any of their words distract her. She had heard it all before. People doubting her abilities was nothing new. As she took a deep breath, she raised her rifle with quiet precision, making small adjustments as her steady hands moved in perfect rhythm. There was no rush, no need to impress anyone. She simply aimed, adjusted for the wind, and focused on the target ahead. The Sharps, meanwhile, continued to make comments, all of them confident that their assumptions would be correct. They thought this was just another moment of laughter, something that would add to their collection of stories about beginners who came and went. But what they didn't know was that Claire's focus wasn't just a moment of concentration. It was the calm before a storm. As she steadied her aim and squeezed the trigger, the air was filled with the sharp crack of the rifle. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The Sharps paused, their laughter fading as they watched in disbelief. They had been so sure she was an amateur, so certain that her shot wouldn't even come close. But Claire's calm determination had just set the stage for something they didn't see coming. The sound of the shot echoed, bouncing off the walls of the range. The Sharps stood frozen, unsure of what had just happened. They had no idea how wrong they were. A few months had passed since the Sharps had changed their approach to shooting. They had learned a lot about themselves, about respect, and about the true meaning of skill. While they continued to visit Ridgewood's shooting range regularly, they no longer felt the need to prove anything to anyone. Their focus had shifted from competing with others to competing with themselves. always striving to be better than they had been the day before. One chilly autumn morning, the Sharps were back at the range, preparing for a casual practice session. The weather was perfect for shooting, cool but not cold, with just enough sunlight to make the range feel alive. As they set up, they couldn't help but remember the day Claire had walked into the range and silenced their arrogance with one perfect shot. They had not seen her since that day, but her impact on them remained. Jake looked around at his friends, his eyes thoughtful. "It's been a while since Claire came here," he said, breaking the quiet hum of the range. Lee, who had been adjusting her rifle, nodded. "Yeah, I wonder if she still comes. She was really good, wasn't she?" "Definitely," Jake agreed. "I still think about that shot sometimes. It wasn't just the accuracy. It was how calm she was. She didn't let anything get to her." The others nodded in agreement. Claire's presence had left a lasting impression on them, one that had shaped the way they viewed not only shooting, but also the world around them. She had shown them that there was more to skill than just flashy displays or loud boasts. True mastery came from quiet confidence, from focusing on what you love rather than what others thought of you. As the Sharps practiced, they noticed a change in how they interacted with others at the range. They no longer judged the new shooters or whispered about them behind their backs. Instead, they offered help when needed and were quick to cheer on others who made a good shot. They had learned the value of community and camaraderie, something they hadn't truly understood before. Toward the end of the session, Jake paused and looked out across the range. He saw a woman walking toward the shooting lanes, carrying a rifle. He didn't recognize her at first, but as she got closer, he realized it was Claire. Without hesitation, Jake walked over to her, his friends following behind him. "Hey, Claire," he said, his voice genuine. "It's been a while. How have you been?" Claire looked up, her face breaking into a small smile. "I've been good. Just came to practice. I see you all are still here." Her voice was calm, just like before. "Yeah, we're still at it," Jake said, glancing back at his friends. "We've been trying to focus more on improving, like you showed us." Claire gave a slight nod, as if she already knew the change in them. "Good to hear," she replied. "The journey's always about growth, not about winning." The Sharps stood together, their respect for Claire shining through. They didn't need her to teach them any more lessons. They had learned enough from her example, and now they were carrying that wisdom forward in their own way. As Claire walked to her lane and prepared for her shot, the Sharps watched her, no longer with envy or competition in their eyes, but with a quiet respect. They had come a long way from the people they had once been, and they knew that, no matter what, they would continue to grow, just as Claire had taught them. The following weekend, the Sharps returned to Ridgewood's shooting range, but the atmosphere was different. As they set up their rifles, there was no loud chatter, no jokes or challenges tossed across the lanes. Instead, the Sharps worked quietly, their minds preoccupied with what had happened the week before. They couldn't stop thinking about Claire and that perfect shot. Jake, who had always been the one to crack jokes and show off, was unusually quiet. He adjusted his rifle with a careful hand, glancing at his friends who seemed equally distracted. Lee, the one who had laughed the most, was the first to break the silence. "I can't stop thinking about last week," she said, her voice softer than usual. "How did she do it? I mean, that shot. It was just so perfect." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time, the Sharps weren't concerned about their own skills or appearance. They were focused on the woman who had taught them a lesson they hadn't expected to learn. Jake nodded, staring at his rifle. "Yeah, I've been thinking about that shot all week. It wasn't just good, it was effortless. And here we are, acting like we're the best." He shook his head. "We were so full of ourselves." Leia sighed, feeling a weight in her chest. "We didn't just underestimate her. We were rude. We laughed at her, thought she was some beginner who didn't know anything." Her face flushed with embarrassment. "I hate that we did that." "I don't think she even noticed," Jake said, his voice thoughtful. "She didn't care what we thought. She just came in, did her thing, and walked out like it was nothing. Maybe we've been too focused on the wrong things." The Sharps stood in silence for a while, letting Jake's words settle in. It was true. Claire hadn't been there for attention or praise. She had come for the love of the sport, to quietly enjoy her time at the range. It was a sharp contrast to how the Sharps had been acting, constantly seeking validation, always trying to outdo each other. After a few moments, Lee spoke again. I think we need to change how we approach things, she said softly. It's not about the fancy gear or how many competitions we've won. It's about respect for the sport and for others. She looked around at her friends, who were now nodding in agreement. They all knew that Claire had shown them something important, something they had missed while focused on their egos. She had taught them that true skill didn't need to be broadcasted. It was something that spoke for itself, through actions, not words. Next time we see her, Jake said, his voice firm, we'll show her the respect she deserves. We'd over that. The Sharps went through the rest of the day with a quiet understanding between them. As they fired their shots, there was no boastful chatter or laughter. Instead, they focused on their form, their aim, and the respect they had for the sport. When they finished, the Sharps packed up their gear, and instead of rushing to leave, they stood together for a moment. They all knew that they had learned a lesson they wouldn't forget. It wasn't just about being good at something. It was about being humble and showing respect to others, no matter where they came from or what they looked like. As they walked out of the range that day, there was a shared sense of growth. The Sharps had been changed by one woman's simple, perfect shot, and they would carry that lesson with them from that day forward. The Sharps had changed since that day. What had started as a group of cocky, overconfident shooters had transformed into a team more focused on improving their skills and supporting one another. They had learned to respect not only the sport, but also everyone who shared it with them, no matter their experience or background. One Saturday, they found themselves back at Ridgewood shooting range, preparing for a new challenge. They had all made significant progress since Claire's visit. Jake, who had once been the loudest and most boastful, now stood quietly, concentrating as he adjusted his rifle. Lee, who had laughed at Claire's skill, now paid more attention to her form, asking for advice when needed. The Sharps had grown, not just in their shooting abilities, but in their humility. This Saturday, however, was different. A local competition was taking place at the range, and the Sharps had decided to participate. It was a chance to test their skills in a real challenge, but there was no arrogance this time. There was only a quiet determination to do their best. As they walked to the registration table, Jake turned to his friends and said, "Remember, this isn't about showing off. It's about improving and having fun. Let's not forget why we're here." The others nodded, agreeing with him. They all knew that this time it wasn't about competing with each other or anyone else. It was about pushing themselves to be better, just like they had seen Claire do. As the competition began, the Sharps took their positions. The range buzzed with energy as competitors lined up at their lanes, taking turns with their rifles. For the first time, the Sharps felt a sense of calm. There were no mirrors, no pressure to be the best. They were simply focused on hitting their targets and improving with each shot. Throughout the day, they watched other shooters take their turns, some hitting the mark, some missing. But instead of laughing or making jokes, the Sharps observed with respect, knowing that everyone was there to learn and grow. They could feel the shift in their attitudes, how their approach to shooting had become about self-improvement rather than proving something to others. As the final round of the competition approached, Jake and his friends had each taken their turns. They had all improved since they had first started at the range, but they knew they still had a lot to learn. When it was Jake's turn, he took a deep breath and aimed at his target. His hands were steady and his mind was calm. When he squeezed the trigger, the shot landed near the bullseye. "Not bad," Lee said, smiling at him. "You're getting better." "Thanks," Jake replies, smiling back. "We all are." By the end of the competition, none of the Sharps had won first place, but they didn't mind. They had learned something far more valuable, that true success wasn't about trophies or titles. It was about growth, respect, and the quiet satisfaction that came from knowing you had done your best. As they packed up their things and left the range, the Sharps couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. They had started as a group of arrogant shooters, but now they were a team, each one more focused on the journey than the result. And even if they never became the best shooters on the range, they knew they had already won in the most important way, by changing how they viewed themselves and others. It was a bright, warm Saturday morning at Ridgewood shooting range. The sun beamed down, casting long shadows on the well-worn wooden booths. The air smelled of fresh grass and gunpowder, and the sound of distant shots echoed in the background. The place was packed with regulars who came every weekend, showing off their high-end equipment. These were the Sharps, a group of experienced shooters who loved nothing more than demonstrating their skills and their expensive gear. The Sharps were loud and confident. They wore custom shirts with logos from exclusive gun brands, and they carried rifles that gleamed in the sunlight. They joked and laughed together, each of them eager to prove they were the best. They spoke with pride about their perfect aim and their countless victories in competitions. No one could beat them, or so they thought. But then, just as the group was settling in, something unexpected happened. A woman walked into the range. She didn't fit in at all. Claire wasn't wearing a flashy shirt or carrying a fancy rifle. She wore faded jeans and a simple flannel shirt, an old baseball cap sitting low on her head. She didn't make a sound as she walked past the Sharps, but they all noticed her. Her appearance stood in sharp contrast to theirs. The group exchanged glances. Some raised their eyebrows, and a few whispered to each other. "Who is she?" One of the Sharps, Jake, asked, trying to keep his voice low, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Probably just some beginner," he added with a chuckle. "Looks like she doesn't even know how to hold a gun." Claire continued walking, not reacting to their quiet comments. She found an empty shooting lane, set down her old, worn rifle, and began adjusting the target. The Sharps couldn't help but watch her. They couldn't believe someone so simple-looking would show up at a range full of seasoned shooters. Leah, one of the Sharps, nudged Jake with her elbow. "You think she even knows how to aim?" she laughed. The others joined in, exchanging smirks and eye rolls. Claire, however, remained calm and focused. She slowly unpacked her gear, taking time to make sure everything was set up correctly. She didn't rush or show any signs of nervousness. There was a quiet confidence in her movements, but it was easy to overlook. The Sharps continued to laugh among themselves, thinking she was just another person who didn't know what they were doing. As Claire lined up her shot, adjusting her stance and breathing slowly, she didn't care about the people around her. She wasn't there to impress anyone. She was there for herself. The Sharps, on the other hand, were too busy making jokes to notice the steady focus in her eyes. They had no idea that they were about to be proven wrong in the most unexpected way. And so, with one last breath, Claire raised her rifle, ready to take her first shot, unaware that this would be a moment that would silence everyone around her. The sharp crack of Claire's rifle echoed across the range. For a brief moment, everything seemed still. The Sharps, who had been laughing just seconds before, stood frozen. The sound of the gunshot hung in the air like a challenge. The target monitor blinked, and everyone's eyes shifted toward it, not quite sure what to expect. Claire lowered her rifle slowly, her hands steady, her face calm. She didn't look at the Sharps or the others around her. She simply watched the target screen, waiting for the result. The Sharps, still standing there in stunned silence, were the first to glance at the screen. It blinked once, then twice, and finally, the score appeared. Perfect. The monitor flashed in bright green letters, marking a perfect bullseye. For a moment, no one spoke. The laughter had stopped, and in its place was an uneasy quiet. Jake, the loudest and most confident of the Sharps, blinked twice as if the screen might be lying. He glanced at Claire, then back at the target, unsure of what had just happened. "There's no way," he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. Leah, who had been laughing the loudest, now stood completely still, staring at the screen in disbelief. How did she do that?" she whispered to herself. She had expected the shot to miss by a wide margin, but there it was, dead center. Claire didn't react to their shock. She simply stood there, her rifle still in her hands, her posture unchanged. It was clear she wasn't trying to impress anyone. To her, it was just another shot, another moment of practice. The Sharps, however, were starting to realize they had made a huge mistake by underestimating her. Slowly, Jake approached the target, still trying to wrap his head around the result. He reached out and touched the center of the bullseye, his fingers brushing against the paper. It was a perfect circle, a perfect shot. He turned to Claire, his face a mixture of confusion and admiration. That's not possible," he said, his voice trailing off. Claire didn't offer a response. She simply packed up her gear, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. It wasn't arrogance. It was just the way she had always been, calm, focused, and unshaken by the opinions of others. The Sharps stood there, exchanging glances, unsure of what to say next. I think we just got shown up, Lee finally said, breaking the silence. Her voice was low, and even she seemed a little humbled. Jake didn't say anything at first. Instead, he just stood there, looking at the target, trying to make sense of it all. He had been so sure that Claire was nothing more than a beginner, someone who didn't belong at the range. But now he realized how wrong he had been. Claire gathered her things slowly, and without another word, she began to walk toward the exit. She wasn't there for praise or attention. She had come to shoot, and that's exactly what she had done. The Sharps watched her leave in silence, their confidence shaken for the first time in a long while. And as Claire stepped outside, the range remained still. The Sharps knew that they would be thinking about that perfect shot for a long time. It wasn't just a lesson about shooting. It was a lesson about judging others and how easily they had gotten it wrong.